I'm representing the Agency of Digitisation under the Ministry of Finance in Denmark. In the next 20 minutes or so, it's my ambition to give you a brief introduction to our daily work with ensuring that Danish legislation is digital ready. So during my presentation, I will touch down upon three main parts. First, I will talk about why it is even necessary to consider digital concerns when we legislate. Second, I will describe our approach to ensuring that legislation is digital ready. I have also brought a couple of examples on how legislation can be digital ready. And then finally, I will discuss what have been some of the lessons learned in Denmark and present some of our current initiatives regarding digital ready legislation in the future. So why should legislation be digital ready after all? The question of why legislation needs to be digital ready is probably best answered by asking what happens when legislation is not made digital ready. The best digital ready legislation was a response to cases in which complex and imprecise rules made it really difficult to implement and administer digital regulation. This was to a large extent the case due to the reasons stated on this slide, like many exceptions and difficult terms in the legislation, unnecessary and manual decisions, which made it really difficult to make processes and decisions digital, and then inconsistent use of terms across different pieces of legislations in different authorities, which made it difficult for these authorities to collaborate and exchange data, and so on. Earlier on implementation of digital solutions was generally not given much attention at the stage of drafting new legislation. This included considerations such as consistent use of terms, risk profiles, impact on users, administrative costs and procedures, and so on. And that made it really, really difficult to implement digital systems. It also made it hard for citizens and firms to see through complex rules. And it also fostered a slow and bureaucratic management of rules in the public authorities. So digital ready legislation is the ambition to make simple regulation where possible, which is easy to administrate for authorities in a digital way. So let's talk about where the digital ready legislation agreement started after all in Denmark. In 2018, a political agreement was reached in the Danish Parliament. The agreement requires all legislation proposed from July 2018 and onwards to be digital ready. The focus was on creating clear and simple legislation that was easy to implement and easy to administrate digitally. The aim of the agreement was to foster a better public service through higher level of transparency and better access to service for all citizens and companies. It was also to create simpler processes and therefore a more effective public sector, which eliminated unnecessary bureaucracy. And then it was also an aim to create a minimum of unexpected pitfalls in digital implementation, as new legislation can result in cost overruns, delays, and incomplete digital solutions if the potential pitfalls are not addressed from the start. Also, it was decided to create a secretariat or a small unit that collaborated with ministries in the public authorities on an ongoing basis regarding guidance and support on how to secure that new legislation was becoming digital ready. This is where I'm sitting. The main part of this task is screening and delivering feedback on draft legislation and giving recommendations on how to create digital good or digital ready legislation. So when new legislation has to be digital ready, it has to fulfill two criteria. First, the rules must have been drafted with 7 key principles in mind. The principles ensure that legislation support the use of digital solutions, and they concern a broad variety of parameters needed to create a digital ready legislation. So I'll just quickly run through them. First, principle 1, new legislation has to be clear in its use of terms, and it has to have unambiguous rules if possible. This make it really the more clear and more simple rules we have in new legislation, the easier it is to make the processes fostered by the legislation digital. Second, all communication between citizens and firms, and then the public authorities, has to be digital. So it has to go on through digital means. Of course, every time new legislation makes it mandatory to use digital communication between citizens and the authorities, there always have to be a thought on the people that cannot use digital means of communicating, and they have to have a possibility to communicate in another way. Third, the third principle, if possible, decisions made by authorities has to be made on objective criteria, which means that the decision by time can be automated. Again, it's not automation for by all means. If decisions made by authorities regarding citizens, for example, can be made by objective criteria, it should not. Then it should be a professional public worker making the decision. But when possible, use objective criteria. Principle 4, reuse of data across all sectors. We value that different parts of legislation across different sectors in the public sector use the same terms and refer to the same registers with the same information, so that the authorities can share data instead of picking up the same data twice or more times from the citizens. This makes a more effective public sector and makes better service for the citizens and the firms. Fifth principle, secure data management. Digital legislation is not all about effective service and administration. It's also about making it transparent and safe for citizens to share their data with the public sector. They should, regarding to principle 5, always have a possibility to access their own data, to see it, and and they should know that it's kept safe from data breaches or other things. Sixth principle, use public infrastructure. So use the already made public infrastructure for communication and so on, instead of inventing something new. And the seventh principle is about preventing errors and fraud by digital means. That's also about using digital systems to check if data is the data is right, and that the information given by citizens and firms are true. All right, let's move on. Furthermore, new legislation also has to carry out an assessment of what implementation consequences the legislation is expected to have. This is all about trying to look forward and say what will happen when we implement this new legislation. What impact can it actually have on IT systems, on organizations, on protecting data, on having an influence on civil life, and how can we make sure when drafting the legislation that we actually prevent some of the risks that can come with implementing the legislation, and also take care of the possible impacts of implementing new legislation. So every time a diesel car drives into a city zone or environmental city zone, it has to have a certain type of filter. So the question is, how do the authorities carry out control with what vehicles can enter the zones and which cannot? And how can control be carried out in an economic and smart and digital way? One way to do it would be in a manual way with personnel, like the police keeping track of vehicles entering the environmental zones. Besides the fact that it would be pretty difficult to control a constantly moving crowd of vehicles manually, it would also demand a significant amount of personnel. Instead, the solution is an automatic control system which scans the license number of every vehicle entering the zones. The scanning technology then connects to central vehicle registers as a way to check if the vehicle meets the required environmental filter standards. So, which principles are met in this legislation or in this solution? It's principle 3, which is all about using objective criteria. So, registration number on a car, that's pretty objective. It can be binary combined with different standards of the car with the registration number. So that can actually be checked without personnel in an automatic way. And this is what has been done in this solution, in this legislation. Another example that I would like to share with you is an example of how data sharing between the private and the public sector can lead to increased value for users. As many of you will be aware, the field of mobility service is undergoing a rapid technological change. These days, it is not an unusual sight for people to travel using a shared electrical scooter or bicycle, or indeed even another person's car. The challenge, however, is that it is becoming a challenge of researching all the different modes of transportation accessible in a given area. So, new legislation in Denmark attempts to tackle this problem by allowing mobility providers to supply data about the availability of their services to existing public sector travel planners, comparable to the likes of for example, the German travel planner Bahn.de, where you can actually access and see all public transport combined in a common planner. This could potentially mean that when a user visits the travel planner, she is suddenly reminded that the ride sharing or electric scooters is an option of transportation nearby in a given area. So this legislation is an example of how data sharing between the private sector and the public sector can lead to a better experience of users of mobility solutions. And I presented examples on how we work to make legislation more fit for the digital age. The work is, of course, not finished, but we have already learned a few lessons that I would like to share with you. First, a lot of improvement can actually be gained by small changes in existing legislation. I hope that was made clear from my examples. By just changing a minor part of an existing legislation, you can actually open up for digital possibilities and digital ways of managing the existing legislation. Second, it takes time to build up awareness and compliance about digital-ready legislation. So our process with digital-ready legislation can be divided into some different phases, but it all starts from the bottom with creating awareness and making digital readiness a priority and a known element for both ministries, politicians, but also private institutions, private organizations, and NGOs. They have to meet the demands and the stories about digital ready legislation a couple of times before it becomes a rolling snowball, being bigger and bigger. It doesn't happen overnight, so it's difficult to implement, and it takes some time. Our efforts with making new technology, new legislation digital ready has to follow the swift advances being made on the technological field. So when we started in 2018, the AI sector or the AI technology wasn't as big as a priority, nor such a big nor such developed as it is today. And this improvement or development on the AI or the digital technology front or sector has to be mirrored in digital ready legislation and the effort we do for keeping up with the technological possibilities. So we have to all the time follow the technological development in order to be able to make legislation which actually fits the technological environment available out there. What are the next steps for us, for the Danish government in regarding to making legislation digital ready? First, we prioritize right now reaching out to policy officers to support that digital ready legislation is a priority throughout the early stages of legislative preparation. What does this mean? It means that often we look through draft legislation when the legislation is actually drafted, but a lot of the material or the rules drafted in legislation actually gets created long time before in political agreements and initiatives long before the drafting of the legislation. And we want to get in early in that process and actually make an influence already when the politicians draft on initiatives or political agreements becoming legislation later on. So that's a big priority for us, being really early in the legislative process. Second, we are continuously supporting law drafters in incorporating digital ready legislation. In order to do so, we offer online guidance for law drafters through digital checklists, case examples, and courses for new hires and ministries. As I talked about in the earlier slide, it's all about creating awareness, especially in ministries forming and drafting the legislation about digital ready legislation. And we do that by having a lot of speaks and having a lot of training and formal activities. Third, a systematic and targeted revision of legacy legislation would enable us to reap the benefits of digital solutions on a wider scale. So it's among our tasks and part of our mandate to look through existing legislation and not only new drafts. Also, the digital possibilities in new draft legislation sometimes, and a lot of the time, actually depends on existing old legacy legislation, which maybe not always has digital ready rules. So we want to look at the old legislation as well as the new. And as a last thing, we also prioritize dialogue with the EU and member states in the European Union in order to play a part of making European legislation more digital fit, because that the European legislation often affects the Danish possibilities of making digital ready legislation or the new legislation more digital ready. So that's also a priority for us. That was it. This is this concludes my presentation on the state of digital ready legislation in Denmark. I hope you found it to be useful and of inspiration to further discussions. You can read more about the subject and find more detailed guidance and case studies on our website, the Agency of Digitisation Denmark. And you're also ready to contact us on the information on our website if more dialogue or question is needed.